parties to this critical and timely panel discussion titled Reckoning and Resistance, Charting a Path Towards Anti-Racism in Social Work. We want to start by thanking Arizona State University School of Social Work for sponsoring this webinar panel discussion. My name is Justin Harty. I'm an assistant professor here at ASU School of Social Work, and I had the great privilege of writing the epilogue for this book, and I will be moderating for today's panel. Okay, so as we convene today to grapple with one of the most pressing issues in social work profession, its paradoxical role as a justice-oriented profession that operates within systems defined by racial hierarchy and structural oppression. As social workers, our aim is to help those who are marginalized and oppressed, but the reality is that our work often exists within the very structures that perpetuate these conditions. The conversations that emerge from this paradox are not just theoretical debates. They result in real harm to the communities that we aim to serve. Our panel comes in the wake of a series of heartbreaking and enraging incidents of anti-Black racism that have catapulted the nation into a renewed urgency to address racial justice. These incidents highlight the lethal persistence of white supremacy and demonstrate that our collective vows and protests have not yet translated into systemic change we desire. Disparities in health, housing, education, and justice continue, heightened further by the desperate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on communities of color. So to engage in these issues, this panel has been structured around four pivotal themes that stem from the book Social Work, White Supremacy, and Racial Justice. The first one is understanding the historical legacy of racism and white supremacy within the social work profession. Two, addressing racism from within, confronting our own biases and the systems in which we operate. Three, envisioning an anti-racist future, moving from practice to policy. And then four, strategies for achieving racial justice in social work education. The conceptualization of this panel stems from the 2021 four-part virtual conference that the panelists have developed into a comprehensive book. The conference, the book, and this webinar aim to serve as tools for social workers and scholars alike to reimagine and work towards a future that breaks free from the status quo of racial injustice. We are at a critical juncture, not just as a profession, but as a society. The issues discussed today aren't just topics for academic debate. They have real-world implications for the people we serve and our nation's social fabric. Therefore, we must organize, collaborate, and build on legacies of historical resistance, striving for a future that is anti-racist and anti-colonialist. We want to thank you for being part of this essential dialogue. But before beginning, I'd like to ask all participants to submit any questions you have for our panelists at any time during this webinar. And please do so by using the Q&A function to enter your questions. At the end, we'll gather these questions and during the Q&A, address as many as possible. So I'd like to begin with some introductions to the panel, beginning with Dr. Laura Abrams. Dr. Laura Abrams is the chair and professor of social welfare at UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, a leading expert in criminal justice and reentry. She focuses on improving the well-being of youth and adults post-incarceration. Dr. Abrams has conducted groundbreaking ethnographic research and has provided testimony at both public and congressional hearings. She's also served as an expert witness in critical legal cases, advocating for humane treatment within the juvenile justice system. We also have Dr. Sandra Edmonds Crewe, who's the Dean and Professor of Social Work at Howard University. She's an expert in caregiving, aging, and social welfare. She has over 40 years of experience in the field, and she has held leadership roles in housing and serves on multiple national boards, including the American Association of Service Coordinators, and she's an NASW pioneer focusing on eradicating social isolation. We also have Dr. Alan Dettlaff, professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, and former child welfare caseworker and administrator. He co-founded the Upend movement, aimed at transforming the family policing system towards healing and liberation. He's the author of a newly published book titled Confronting the Racist Legacy of the American Child Welfare System, The Case for Abolition. Dr. Dettlaff is also the co-founder editor of the Abolitionist Perspectives in Social Work Journal. And lastly, we have Dr. James Herbert Williams. who's the Arizona Centennial Professor of Social Welfare at Arizona State University School of Social Work and Director of ASU's Center for Child Wellbeing. He's renowned for his comprehensive research in K-12 academic performance, youth violence, and delinquency prevention. His work spans from addressing mental health in urban schools to promoting health among African-American women. His research and publications encompass key themes like human security, economic sustainability, and health equity. Dr. James Herbert Williams is deeply committed to community service, focusing on health disparities, juvenile justice, and positive youth development. Okay, so now I would like to ask the panelists to present on 4 main themes of the book, and we'll start with Laura, who will be tackling part 1 on social work's historical legacy of racism and white supremacy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Justin and Arizona State University, and of course, our lovely team of co-editors who I've had the privilege to work with on this unique volume. And I'm really excited to be here and talk about the contents of the book and part 1 and what we can do with the information as scholars, as educators, as practitioners, and in our coursework as well. So this project, as Dr. Harty mentioned, was launched about 4 years ago. And from the inception to now, when we looked at the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that our profession appeared to begin to embrace, or at least to engage in, conversations that we feel had been ongoing, but also heightened around 2020. So as co-editors for this work, we had an open call for submissions. We received a bunch of high quality proposals and ended up doing a 4-part series instead of 3. And we're able to include 40 chapters in this massive book. So I had the honor to edit part 1, which focuses on social work's historical legacy of racism and white supremacy. In part 1, which has 10 chapters, the chapters are unified in examining how social workers construct race, racialization, and the influence and use of racial discourses and the application of practices and policies of exclusion, segregation, displacement, and coercion, often applied to women of color and people of color more broadly. One interesting part of the book is that we have these themes in the historical piece around racialization and racial ideology, but cuts across various aspects of social work, from child welfare, juvenile justice, immigration, education and school social work, housing, and urban development. What I love about this part of the book, as someone who's dabbled in history and was a history major in undergrad, is the use of unique methodologies to trace these discourses and how they led to various practices. For example, some of our authors use archival materials, photographs, maps, social work archives. So it's a really unique way to think about how to build knowledge in social work by digging into these artifacts. There's also much to learn by looking at the past. So I know that many of us came from CSWE in the fall and SWR this last week. And a lot of talk about, what we understand about race and racialization and what we don't understand about race and racialization, including in the era of anti-DEI and other attacks on talking about racism. But here we have a critical lens that goes into the real nuances about racialization and also how it applies to many ethnicities and cultural groups including Black and Indigenous populations, but also other populations that were racialized as subjects of social work practice in the early years of the profession. Next slide. So I wanted to acknowledge the authors and talk a little bit about some of the ways that I grouped these chapters. So in the first part, we have agents of segregation, social workers, institutions, and urban spaces. And this part looks at how social workers actively participated in segregation in different contexts. So for example, in the first chapter, Hillier and Bodie talk about the settlement movement and Philadelphia's 7th Ward, a book project that they're working on, which is really interesting, thinking about how early social reformers worked with W.B. Du Bois on actually segregating Philadelphia's 7th Ward and studying that area. Samantha Goose also talks about the response of school social work to racial segregation in American public schools using archival data. And in this section, Robert Cosby talks about gentrification and the history of power and oppression for older Black adults in Washington, D.C. In the second part of the book, we have 3 chapters, all anchored around the issue of social work's treatment of migrant and immigrant populations. Again, the theme of displacement comes up. So Yusun Park, Dr. Park from UPenn talks about what we understand about absent critiques, or kind of what social workers said and didn't say about Asian Americans, anti-Asianism, and social work discourses of who were welcome as immigrant communities in the US in the early parts of social work and who was not welcome. Benjamin Roth's chapter talks specifically about the forced deportation of Mexican origin residents from 1917 to 1933, and how social workers in the early years of the conferences and charities and corrections considered Mexican American origin residents not suitable for citizenship in the US. Alicia Chatterjee also talks about displacing a whole community of Black Indigenous folks in Maine, and how social workers participated in settling and evicting Malaga Island, all new historical documents. In the last section, we have white supremacy and gendered racism, legacies of exclusion and coercion. These 4 chapters tackle the intersections of gender and race in terms of how whiteness formed the basis of coercion in child welfare services, mental health services, and the welfare state itself. So for example, Melissa Murphy talks about exclusion and the problem of in institutional racism in mental health services. Selleck, Tolan, and Blakely, and Jones and Haynes tackle the history of child welfare and how Black folks initially denied services in child welfare were eventually becoming the subjects of family separation and coercive control through child welfare services. Jessica Toff's final chapter in this section talks about mothers and motherhood and the history of how social workers framed citizenship for mothers who received TANF, and Black mothers in particular. Next slide. So what are the major themes? We have, all of these 10 chapters are very unique. They all work with different types of data. And so I'm just going to talk about a few pieces that I feel really come through in the book, and that can help our social work education overall. One is this idea of excavating untold stories and perspectives. And that kind of goes with the last box here, who has told social work history, in the sense that a lot of what we have to rely on is a white perspective, is a white woman's dominated perspective. people who took client notes, who took case notes, people who wrote and led the National Conference of Charities and Corrections, people who started our journals, right? So these chapters have to work with the data that we have, but they also try to excavate or bring about untold perspectives. And I think that's a really unique part of the book, and a tradition that I hope will continue in social work scholarship. Another major theme is the issue of professionalization and white saviorism. So beyond the idea that, as a woman's profession, that we needed to become more professional, so to speak, that we wanted to advance our profession with, in relation to nursing and medicine and public health. We also see how the particular discourses of white saviorism cause tremendous harm to communities of color and perpetuated gendered racism. And lastly, I just want to point out that the chapters provide a lot of nuance around discourses of whiteness and white supremacy, and shows how social work, in our paradoxical role that we probably a thread throughout the book, that a lot of this is under the guise of a helping profession. And so it's not all racialization, and it's not all an enactment of white supremacy, but we kind of get to see how particular structures and discourses and examples of how those have caused immense hurt and poverty, and kept people entrenched in systems. Last slide, and then I'm at 10 minutes, so I will end now. I wanted to point out that in terms of use of the book, that there's a lot of ways to use this section and all of the sections. It's a great reading to accompany any textbook in the social welfare history and policy classes, covering the history of the profession from the inception almost to present day, but particularly around when we think about the mothers of social work, Jane Addams and Mary Richmond. It goes way beyond that, and I think it can help take away just the white gaze of thinking through our profession. There's many chapters that could be used in any type of advanced policy class, school social work, and any class on immigration or migration. And so again, I want to congratulate our team and all of the contributors to section 1 and all the sections for their incredible scholarship, and I hope people will read the book. So my part is done.
Thank you. I'd now like to pass it on to Dr. Sandra Edmonds Crewe.
Thank you so much, Dustin. Here at Howard University, we have always focused on this topic. And so when I was invited by my colleague Laura to join this team, it was absolutely a perfect fit, because we've always considered the importance of mission and major. And so when we think about our historical legacy here at Howard, we have always been groundbreaking and thinking through these things. So again, I certainly appreciate the opportunity to work with my colleagues on this very important topic. If I were to reframe this, I would say, this is my life. This is my life, working in the area of social justice. As Justin said earlier, this is not simply an academic exercise. It is a life we live. And it's also our legacy as social workers. So if we see it going in a different direction, it is our opportunity to change this direction that we are going in. What's in front of you on this slide is the part 2 that I had the unique responsibility of working with 28 authors as we think about reflections on our past and our present. So we have really kind of thought through this whole topical area. And as I started thinking about what would be a great graphic for this, And it's certainly the one that you see on the slide, but I'm thinking of a quilt. Often in African American history, there were quilting parties. And a part of that quilting party network was to be connected with each other, but also to produce a product that was useful. So this is our quilt in part 2 of it, when we began to think about addressing racism from within the profession. It is easy to criticize what others are not doing, but this was an opportunity for us to take an inside lens. I'm so very grateful to the authors who contributed to this area. They are all listed there. I'm not going to call their names, but you should recognize who they are. This whole part 2 was divided into 3 sections. So the first 3 authors, 3 chapters really focused on calling out racism through uprooting whiteness. Calling out racism through uprooting whiteness. It really was a response to the calls for social workers and social work educators to examine our goodwill and to ensure that it does not harm. You know, in social work, we talk about causing no harm, but it was to examine our goodwill to make sure that we were not causing harm as we really attempted to go about our business of the profession. So these authors really helped us to kind of frame our thinking around this whole area of racism from within. So again, when they talked about, they reminded us of the responsibilities of interrogating not just our past, but our current situation. And so they did an excellent job in really bringing this to our the forefront, using different methodologies of sharing the story. I am uniquely impressed with the personal narratives that they share here as we think about reflections on our past and our present. Part 2 of the section really focused on women of color and those who are enduring and confronting racism within the profession. Now, I know a little something about this topic beyond an academic area of thinking about it. But what the authors did was to contribute their unique experiences of women of color in academic spaces. So the authors listed in chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 really revealed parts of themselves and connected it to the academic setting as we look at this. What was also particularly unique is that they included students as well as esteemed faculty members who've been working in this area for some time. But they called us out. They called us out in the areas that were important for us to focus on how we move forward in our quest to make things better. Again, they collectively tell a unique story that we should really focus on. We are a profession that's dominated by women, by females, but sometimes the oppressive practices happen to us. And these authors really help us to understand what that looks like. And part 3, section 3, we then turn our lens to social work education, focusing on combating racism in practice and in theory. So starting with chapters 8, 9, and 10, we really take a deeper dive in thinking about how we have used our educational space to make a difference, or how we have used our educational space to maintain the status quo. So the authors really kind of help us to see there certainly is light at the end of the tunnel, but we have to be willing to move from where we are to the next generation of scholarship as we begin to think about reflections on our past and our present. You know, here at the Howard University School of Social Work, and I mentioned this in my introduction, our legacy was about breaking barriers. Our founding dean, Dr. Annabelle Burns Lindsay, found herself in a leadership position here at Howard, where students were segregated in their placements, but yet the profession was really focused on social justice, but yet we were practicing social injustice. Next slide, please. So here we are. We have these 28 voices that have united to share these experiences that we think are important. And what do these authors tell you in these 3 sections? Well, first, they challenge the ahistorical perspective. For example, when we think about the founders of the profession, often we marginalize those persons of color, and they become an add-on in our text rather than an integral part of thinking about the profession and what contributions we have made in the profession. So the authors sort of unite to say, you know, there's a part of our history that we have really not centered, but placed at the edges. The authors also talk about their lived experience with racism and white supremacy. So this is certainly not about someone else's story. They share their story and how they have addressed it or how their institutions have not addressed this. So when they think about and talk to us, and it does feel like a conversation, by the way, when you read their chapters, it's a conversation with you about how we have lived through these experiences, but yet are still here to fight the good fight. You know, it reminds me of John Lewis when he talks about making good trouble. I think this is what we heard in this part of the book. Individuals who are willing to take the chances, to share their narratives and make good trouble. Again, the unique experiences of women in color in academic spaces. You will read about something that we commonly refer to as the Black tax as we sort of move forward. What does it mean? The Black women's tax, the added burden of being a Black female faculty member, and the intersections of womanism, feminism, as we begin to think, what does that mean? And how we have an opportunity to change this narrative as we're looking forward. We also talk about individuals and institutional hurts. As you listen and respond to the authors, they will tell you how institutional hurts really carry forth, but yet the individual hurts follow the individuals through their tenure processes and all those kind of things. So as we kind of think about the challenges that we have experienced, we have the opportunity to really make a difference, not only in the next generation, but the current generation of scholars that we are addressing at this point. And certainly as we look toward the themes of this, we see that there are failures in the academic settings. We can absolutely do better. And they show us the pathway of doing this, how institutions have adopted critical race theory, how they show us how you can include the contributions of African-American men in the academic settings they have. They show us how you can reverse the trends of the isms, sexism, and racism in the places that we are in. They show us that, you know, there's not only a collective responsibility, there's an individual responsibility. But equally important, the authors let us know we have the responsibility to call people in and to call people out. And it is a clear blueprint, in my opinion, for us to make the changes that we talk about. Next slide, please. The complexities in social work really require that we take a self-awareness strategy, and the authors again focus on that. They also tell us how we can implement impactful programs. and not, they are speaking from what has been done, not simply from what is a vision. So there are bold curricular and pedagogical initiatives that you will find integrated throughout these chapters that focus on racism and structural supremacy. I had the unique opportunity of speaking with Dr. Joyce Ladner a couple of weeks ago and sharing this book with her. Dr. Ladner was the editor of the renowned text, The Death of White Sociology. And there are parallels with what the authors have said about in the death of white sociology to the death of what we believe is important to racism in social work. So again, we focus on elevating those who have been at the margins, not simply those that we've been historically taught at who were the leaders of our profession, the founders of our profession. They let you know there's room at the table for more, and you should make sure that you open the door for that room at the table for more. And in closing, they recognize that historical organizations who have made a difference, such as the National Association of Black Social Workers and the Black Panthers, we need to move them from the margins to the center of what we think about change as it relates to racism and oppression within the profession. I hope that you will become a part of this narrative in part 2, and you will take away from it things that you can integrate in the classroom settings, critical thinking across various areas. And again, I am so deeply grateful to the authors who shared with you. And I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I'd like to move to Dr. Ellen Dettlaff, who will be taking up part 3.
Thanks, Justin. And I'll echo what the other panelists said just about what an honor it was to work with all of you on the production of this multi-part conference going back years now, and then going through all of the process of writing this book. It's just an honor. I started my introduction to part 3 with a quote from Frantz Fanon, who decades ago wrote a book that's widely read, widely cited, particularly by people who are working in abolitionist and movement spaces, that I think really kind of sums up what this whole section part 3 is about. And in that book, he wrote, "Their ears hear the true voice of the country, and their eyes see the great and infinite misery of the people. They realize that precious time has been wasted on futile discussion. They realize at last that change does not mean reform, that change does not mean improvement." And that really captures the spirit of part 3, which has a goal of looking at these emerging movements that are really actively working to dismantle racism and white supremacy that have been present in social work since its very earliest origins, and looking at what the future of social work could be if we think about social work differently. So looking at what is the future we wish to see, what's the role of social work in that future, and really interrogating this idea of performance. How much of what social work is built on now is performance? I would argue that a lot of it is, when you compare what our code of ethics says versus the way we actually practice, and the idea of whether social work has the courage to move forward. Because in many ways, when you think about it, creating or defining an anti-racist future is simple. An anti-racist future is a future without racism. But the actual work to get to that anti-racist future is very complex, given both the history of the United States that was built on ideas of racism and white supremacy, but also acknowledging that all of the systems that were built following abolition of slavery, all of the systems, or many of the social service systems that social workers work in today, were also built on ideas of racism and white supremacy. So to really bring about an anti-racist future, that will never happen through simple reforms, because reforms will never change the underlying architecture that was built on white supremacy. And if we look at improving these systems, many of our actions to improve the systems that social workers work in actually just expand the reach and the harm that those systems cause. So eliminating racism, bringing about an anti-racist future, requires a recreation of both society and the systems that social workers work in. I say in this introduction that, in short, eliminating racism requires a revolution, and I really mean it. Eliminating racism isn't going to come easy, and that's the topic that some of these chapters address. Next slide, Justin. So part 3 is really organized into 3 sections, acknowledging the challenges that social work has in moving towards this future, but trying to look at what a future for our profession can be that moves from performance to action, that works by eliminating systems of harm, extricating ourselves out of those systems of harm, and building something new. So in our first section, Toward a New Vision of Society Powered by Our Moral Imagination, we start this section with the idea of imagination. And in this context, imagination is really defined as a skill that we have to develop. Much of the future that we want to see is difficult to imagine because in many ways it's beyond what we have the capacity to imagine, because we've been socialized to think within the limits of a capitalist racist society that we've all been socialized in. So in a lot of ways, the future we wish to see needs to start to be created by developing our skill to build our imagination to move beyond what we've been socialized to think about. So the essays in this first section help us think past these limitations through futures thinking and through Afrofuturism to really push our imagination forward. Then in section 2, Abolitionist Strategies for Achieving Liberation, we build on that idea of imagining an anti-racist future with 4 chapters that look very specifically at abolitionist strategies toward achieving that future. And the focus here is on abolition of carceral systems. And I think that that's both necessary and intentional, that that's the bulk of the chapters in this section. Because simply an anti-racist future cannot exist alongside the carceral state. When we think of our carceral systems like prisons, policing, child welfare, family police, immigration detention, involuntary mental health services, all of the places where social workers work, those systems exist for the purpose of perpetuating and maintaining racism and oppression. Our carceral systems exist today for the purpose of white capitalist accumulation that can only be maintained through the subjugation and oppression of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx Americans. So an anti-racist future has to start with a future that not just imagines, but works towards ending those systems. And that's what the chapters in that part of that section of part 3 cover. And then in the final section of part 3, reimagining our future starts now, social work's role in radical change. We turn kind of more specifically to the roles of the social work profession and social work academia in bringing about this anti-racist future. So we have abolition of carceral systems, abolition of carceral social work. That's a big part of that future, but this section really gets into what does the profession need to do? What is the work the profession needs to engage in? We start looking at research practices because in many ways, the ways that social workers engage in research, particularly those of us who are in academic settings, and the ways that academia rewards certain forms of research over other forms of research maintain the racist oppressive society that we're existing in. We're rewarded for things like quantity over substance. That continually reinforces the white supremacist ideas that academia was built on, with this continual quest for things like impact factors, federal research grants, other measures that really aren't about impact, but are about more accumulation, capitalist accumulation of the very ideas that maintain white supremacy. So in this section, we're trying to look at some strategies that the profession can engage in. Next slide, Justin. And then just to kind of review, these are kind of the major themes of this section, starting with futures thinking, using Afrofuturism to imagine what our different futures might look like. Also addressing the co-optation of abolitionist language, abolitionist strategies. Many of you know that I do my work in child welfare abolition spaces. When I first started talking about this work, we talked about transformation of the child welfare system, recreation of the child welfare system. And now the federal government's talking about transformation. But when they say transformation, that has nothing to do with the transformation that I and the people that I work with talk about. So looking at how other professional organizations co-opt our language and how to resist that. Then really looking at our role, social work's role in the abolition of carceral systems, starting with removing ourselves from those systems. Looking at what non-carceral strategies in social work might look like, dismantling white supremacy culture in research. And then there's a really great chapter about abolition of whiteness, which is probably a new concept for many people. And it really has to do with this idea of what decolonization really means. When I started, I mentioned the work of Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, and again, would just recommend reading. If you really want to understand what decolonization means, read Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And that, because that really is about ending a system of colonization, which this country's existed in for decades. And then what I hope this section overall provides is not just some thinking of strategies to realize the change that we want to see, but I hope that the chapters in this section really move us to action. So to kind of end where we started, to really bring about this anti-racist future that we want to see, we have to realize, social work has to realize that the future we want to see is not going to come from reforms. It's not going to come from improving the existing systems and structures that we work in. If we really believe that the anti-racist future we want to see will only come from recreation, think about what recreation means. Recreation can only come when what was formerly created no longer exists. And that's what I think the future of our work needs to involve. We also need to realize that we as individual social workers are more powerful as a collective than the elites who run our profession, particularly who run our professional organizations. We are not going to get to the future that we want to see with our professional organizations leading us there. We have the power to bring about the change that we want to see. I closed this section of my introduction to this section with a quote from Angela Davis, which many of you are probably familiar with, who says, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do that all the time." I think that's really important to kind of keep some hope alive for all of us who look at the system structures, look at the state of the world that we live in and are frustrated by it. But after I wrote this introduction, I came across another quote. That's the one that I think about more often now to really kind of keep me going and keep my hope alive. And it's from Arundhati Roy, who said, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." So that's what I hope this section of the book inspires in all of us.
Thank you so much, Alan. I'd like to now move to Dr. James Herbert, who will be tackling section 4.
Well, thank you, Justin, and I want to thank the people who are attending today. And a couple of thank yous before I get into section 4 of the book. A thank you to, and we've already said this, to Justin and to my colleagues, staff here at ASU, and our director for all of the work that went into behind the scenes to launch and to host this webinar. So section 4 really is moving of the book, sort of talks about sort of how to strategies that we can put into place for achieving racial justice in social work education. It's always wonderful to follow Alan because he speaks so well and captures so many different ideas in such few words. But I too am driven by many of the people, the scholars who came before us. So in the beginning of my section, that I took a quote from Derek Bell, from what I can consider his work on Faces at the Bottom of the Well, which I think captures a lot of sort of the struggle that Blacks have had in this country since we first landed here as slaves. But he also talks about that even though we're at the bottom of the well, and even though there may be whites that are just above us, they still do not want to reach down to bring us along with them. And then, as my colleagues mentioned, this whole project happened during the pandemic and during when there was a lot of racial injustice and murdering of Blacks that was pretty prominent throughout the news. And whenever those types of situations happens, it always brings me back to a quote by James Baldwin, where he says, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time." And I think that sort of is really for people who are not Black men, when you see those types of things happening on TV, when you know that they're happening on a day-to-day basis, it does sort of continue to put you in a stage of rage and a stage of fear in many ways. So all I can say is that actually the 1963 speech of Martin Luther King of "I Have a Dream," we still yet have not achieved what he was searching for. So I was the editor for for part 4, which was about education and about how do we move forward within the social work education to prepare students and prepare practitioners to really sort of practice with the anti-racist and a racial justice lens. This section has 10 chapters. And of those 10 chapters, there's 21 authors, 21 different authors that had a chance to publish in these things. I applaud the work that we did for this particular book because many of these people are not your traditional academics. They're practitioners, they're clinical people, they're PhD students. And I think by hearing that voice and the narratives, it allows this book and allows this section to really sort of have multiple types of voices that are speaking in regards to the work that they're doing and how the best way to look forward. So it's not coming from a hierarchical perspective. It's really trying to be much more horizontal and in the narratives that we're capturing in the work that's being done here. Again, I want to thank the authors of this section because I think they did a wonderful job. And I encourage you, if you have an opportunity, to really sort of read some of the materials that these authors produced. So this particular section talks about strategies for developing this anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and mostly a trauma-informed curricula. And I think that's an important thing that gets lost in the work that we're doing, is because that we have found that in especially communities of color, trauma is probably omnipresent throughout lots of the things that are going on in those communities. And thinking about how trauma-informed work can really be helpful in those areas. As with the other 3 sections, the methodologies were unique and it allowed people to discuss other ways of knowing and other ways of learning. They used things like personal narratives, and then they also talked about sort of more pedagogical knowledge and survey research, but also practice experiences. So I'd like to, before we go to the next slide, I want to go through the 4 sections. This chapter, this part is divided up into 4 sections, similar to the other chapters. The first section is entitled Dismantling Anti-Racist Pedagogy and Social Work Research. And that sort of focuses on racism and what racism looks like in the school in university settings from a student's perspective. But then also the whole aspects of advancing sort of cultural disruptive pedagogies as we dismantle anti-racism, anti-Black racism in the social work curriculum. Now, Alan mentioned about the major social work organizations, and I think most of our schools base a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the things that we have in our curriculum on the EPAS or the social work, the expectations that school will train in a certain way. But the reality is that I think that is a challenge for us as a profession, and a challenge for us in our particular schools. So I'd love to hear as we go to the discussion of how people are addressing these types of issues within their school. The second section of this part is Envision a Future for Social Work, Looking Back, Looking Forward. And the 3 chapters here really talks about different epistemologies for dismantling whiteness in the schools of social work, how we can envision and erase an anti-racist profession, and then also looking at sort of much more creative ways of addressing these ways. So and the authors did a wonderful job in this area. The third section is on whiteness and white supremacy theory, education and practice. This really talks about the only way we can end racism is through ending white supremacy, and sort of how do we as a profession and how do we sort of manage white fragility in our classroom, especially if you're a teacher of color, if you're a professor that's from of color, and then sort of creating sort of an anti-colonial academic space for social work education. And this sort of that chapter is written by 2 scholars and from Canada that really takes a look at this work from a Canadian perspective. And I think it was nice to have that sort of an additional North American story in the book that's related. And then the last section of this part is anti-racism, anti-oppressive social work education and practice. And really that those 3 chapters focus on developing, those 2 chapters, sorry, focus on developing curriculums, and then also remedying sort of the foundation of social work education, and moving towards more of an actionable anti-racist pedagogy. So next slide. So I list here probably some of the, if I was doing a word map, then of some of the words that sort of that jumps out in this section, terms like dismantling and whiteness and white supremacy, and they also talk a lot about theory, about education, research, and practice. And then you see on this slide is that I also highlighted what are some of the themes, some of the themes of the chapter, and I went through some of them as I talked earlier. But the other thing that we talked about is, and Alan mentioned it before me, of social work research and how social work research really sort of perpetuates racism in our profession. And I can only speak from my work that when I first came into academia, that a lot of the research that was being done was comparing Blacks to whites, or comparing Latinx to whites, and which means that you're always working from somewhat of a deficit model. And also the research is always done to make whites look better. So we need to move into some new terminologies and some new ways of how we do this particular work in this particular area. Again, I want to thank my colleagues. So a little history about this. When we first started, Alan and Laura came to me, and so I probably also came to Sandra with this idea of the 4-part symposium that was done at a time when I think the nation, especially in our profession, was really hurting, because what we were seeing on a daily basis of sort of people's Black Lives Matters protests and things, and also the constant replaying, as news media do, of the knee on the neck, which I think I don't even need to tell you the rest of that, because you all know what that would be about. And then I think that pain brought about some wonderful narratives and knowledge that our colleagues came to presented in person and virtually doing the talk. And although we have 40 chapters in this book, there were more presentations on the symposium. And I'm sure that maybe Alan or someone can put it in the link, that you can go to the University of Houston's website and you can pull up all of the different presentations that was done during the 4-part symposium. Many of them from these 40 chapters, but some additional work that was there that people chose not to turn into chapters. So hopefully that you will find that work useful, as you're in your classroom or as you think about your practice, and hopefully that you will find parts of this book, many parts of this book, useful as you are teaching your courses, or as you are supervising or training students, or incorporating some of these techniques within your own practice on a day-to-day basis. So we're happy you're here with us. Thank you.
Thank you. We're on the same page. Laura reminded me to put the links in the chat. So attendees, you'll see links in the chat to the archive symposium sessions and also to the book. So for this next part, we'll be moving on to the panel discussion. And so what I've done is for each section, I'll be posing a question that I'll ask the panelists who led that section to respond to. And also just a reminder, if you have any questions that you'd like us to take up in the Q&A, please put them into the Q&A. So this first question is for Laura, focusing on the pressing issue of social work's historical legacy of racism and white supremacy. Okay, so the question is, in what ways has the guise of benevolence or charity in social work inadvertently perpetuated harmful stereotypes or further marginalized racialized communities, and how can the profession critically reflect on and address these contradictions?
Thank you, Justin. Big question. That could be a whole class, semester class. So I just want to start by saying that there are big thinkers and historians and social work scholars who've kind of tried to unpack this question in various ways, both in terms of looking at the history of the welfare state, along with, various, like I'm thinking about Mamie Abramowitz's book early on about women in the welfare state, and there's been other, great scholars, but mostly a lot of folks outside of social work writing about social work and racialization. And interestingly, what I like, in this volume is we have folks from within, scholars of color, doctoral students, and up to senior faculty kind of taking a look from within, which I think gives us a little bit of a different perspective. In terms of the actual question about the benevolence piece, when you think about the history of the charity state or the helping, how that was initially construed in our profession was white middle-class Christian women or upper middle class saving others from their plight of poverty, or trying to do that moral uplift type of work that really started a tradition of overcoming the odds or being lifted out of your circumstances, versus kind of what Alan was talking about, changing the structures and systems themselves that are creating the conditions of oppression. And even though we've had those two strains of the profession, and I think if you're currently, as we're currently practitioners and educators, we're always talking about the dual role of social work, right? But what happened was, and I think this goes into all the other parts of the book, is that the founders or the mothers of the profession in those white women going more from a religious and moral uplift standpoint are the ones who created the very structures that we're still working in: the juvenile court, the child court, mental health institutions, right? And they participated in practices of eugenics, and they participated in practices of exclusion and taking removal of children from their families and locking children up for long periods of time for what they saw as deviant behavior, right? So I guess the answer to the second part of the question is, the more we know about how these institutions developed, I think the more we can dismantle. So I like thinking about this as I guess I like to know the history in order to think about where to go next. So I think in that way, starting from the premises of what this book is digging up and excavating can help lead us toward that just future that Alan and James Herbert were discussing.
Thank you. Do any of the panelists want to respond? Everything
Yeah, I think a quick, not a response, a quick add-on to what Laura said. So I think not only was the founders of our profession was of that certain demographic, is that they had values of the other people on society as not being adequate. So parents, so Black parents was never considered to be good parents just because they were Black parents, and the way that the juvenile justice system was put together was that the whole aspects of wayward youth, right? There was these terminologies that were used that automatically set a sort of that everything that was being done in our profession was done based on a certain culture. And so if you weren't functioning within those cultures, then your behaviors and your family development and all those other things was abnormal, so to speak.
Thank you. I want to move to a question for Sandra, and of course, other panelists can respond to this as well. The question is, how does social work history reveal its role in perpetuating racism, and how can reflecting on past and present injustices from both personal and professional perspectives help address it from within the profession?
Thank you so much. And sort of I'll tag team with my other colleagues on the response to the earlier question. Again, I have some internet instability, so if you see me go on and off camera, I am still paying attention and I'll come back on. But social work was built upon the gold standards, and the gold standards came from who we perceived had value in the profession. And so we continued that. This is how you do it, based upon work with individuals who did not necessarily look like me, or nor did we value individuals' opinions look like me. So as I sort of think about this question, I really sort of reflect back to the founding of our School of Social Work, where we had to really decide what is our underpinning, our philosophical underpinning. We couldn't find it in the textbooks. So we really had to create something that we refer to as the Black perspective, meaning that we are examining all social work issues or society issues through the lens of the principles of affirmation, strengths, diversity, internationalization, vivification, and social justice. So everything gets examined through those lenses, but it's often challenged. And so I really want us to kind of think about how we carry forth belief systems and are sometimes doing it unintentionally. So I think the response is to be intentional. Be intentional about what we do. We talk about the agency-based education as being our signature pedagogy. Well, what does that really mean if the agency is racist? If the agency that we are sending our students to are carrying out practices that feel racist or sexist or in other ways. And I don't know that we have spent enough time in thinking about this. How do we prepare our agencies for our focus on anti-racism? Because very often the agency-based instructors were trained under the guiding philosophies that we talked about that were harmful. And so here's an opportunity through the readings in this book to really think differently about this. I can't tell you how many of our students will come back and say, you know, Dean Crewe, I was told that that's not a real framework, the Black perspective. Well, that's because they don't see it in the literature that they were taught from. So I think that happens throughout. As I spoke earlier, I talked about making sure we move cultural intelligence into the mainstream of the conversation, not at the fringes of the conversations. So when we think about how we assign readings to our students, it's not, here's a textbook and here are the supplemental readings. It almost feels like the supplemental readings should become the textbook in terms of doing this. So here's an opportunity for us to flip our orientation, and because there's racism in the publications work, who gets published and who doesn't. And so I think here's an opportunity for us to think about the signature pedagogy and how we make sure what we're saying in the classroom is happening in the agencies that we are assigning our students to. So I know that was a long answer, but I think, you know, those are the takeaway points that you know, I pulled from that question, that we have to take this out of the margins of the curriculum and bring it to the mainstream of the curriculum and value other ways of knowing. Value other ways of knowing and not simply marginalize that as, and by the way, you could think of it. No, this is what we have to think about. And it is really very integral as we think about the licensing disparities. It has a lot to do with how people with lived experiences view the question. If my lived experience said that I should do A, B, and C with the system that I'm serving, I'm having a difficult time code switching on the exam that does not recognize the value of my lived experience in working with minoritized populations. So thank you. Open to feedback.
Thank you. You were getting many head nods from James Herbert. So I think
that matters. You know, that, you know, a nod from James Herbert, that's really, you know, creme de la creme.
Thank you. So we're going to do a bit of a shift. So I had prepared questions for the panelists during this next part, but we are getting some amazing critical questions coming in from the Q&A that I want to pivot to. So I'd like to take this first one, and Laura, thank you for flagging that for Alan. I think this is a great question for Alan to take up. So the question from the panel or from an attendee is, as a profession, we have focused significant attention on racism and racist structures in society. How do we best go about focusing energy about dismantling racism within the profession, given these two tensions are interrelated?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Thanks for the pivot. I think that's a really great question, and I have lots of thoughts about it. I'll try to be short so we can get to some other ones, though. And I think the key to that is the phrase "as a profession," and thinking critically about who is the profession of social work, who decides what the profession is when we say the profession. We often think of the profession as being led by our professional organizations, and particularly NASW, the National Association of Social Workers, who in many ways defines what social work is, puts out this code of ethics that defines what practice looks like, and in many ways define what the future of social work is going to be, versus thinking of us, the social workers who care about racism and dismantling racist structures in ways that NASW does not. NASW has absolutely no interest in dismantling the racist structures that we all work in. And I'll give you some really concrete examples of that. In summer 2020, much of this started because Laura and I wrote a letter to NASW asking them to at least reflect on our practice collaboration with the police. Consider aligning with the defund the police movement, which was emerging at that time, and having some critical conversations about that. That letter was co-signed by over 1,100 social workers and sent to NASW, and NASW never even acknowledged receipt of that letter. Later that summer, I had the opportunity to talk to then CEO of NASW, Angela McLean, who was interested in moving the profession toward a little bit more stances to address racial justice. And I gave Angelo 3 ideas that I thought were really low-hanging fruit for the profession, for NASW. I asked for NASW to take a stand against solitary confinement, for NASW to support minimum age laws in the juvenile legal system, and for NASW to acknowledge that the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act did not go far enough to really address the problems in policing. He refused all 3 of those things and specifically said that their members in Middle America would not like that. NASW is not interested in addressing racism or racist structures in our society. So what we have to do as a profession is acknowledge that NASW is a harmful racist institution and divest ourselves from that, because the future that we want to see is not going to come if we rely on NASW to get us there.
Thank you. The panelists have any additional thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know that I fully agree with that, ending the alliance, but it doesn't preclude having other alliances. And so I think we have opportunities as a profession to align ourselves with different groups. For example, there's a National Association of Black Social Workers as well. And I think there are members of NASW who are aligned with social justice. So, but again, I value and appreciate different perspectives, but I don't see it as a one-way street.
I think I wanted to add that it feels like we have this cycle of, a racist or a horrific act happens in our society, or we have a crisis, and then we go back to the beginning. And so I guess, I'd like to think through, and maybe we don't have all the answers, right? But how do we take what the history and what's currently being done and and keep building a movement rather than starting over, or starting from, the position of we need to do something. So in terms of, career like contribution and what, I hope this book will do will be when the next time we have a racial crisis or we have, I guess, a widespread movement calling on social workers to do more, which our students are always asking, right? That we aren't going back to the drawing board, and that we have this, not just this work, but all the work that so many people are doing, organizing, all the grassroots movements, and including things that CSWE and NASW, the pockets where they are perhaps advancing our knowledge around these pieces. I wonder just what the through line can be, right? How do we keep the momentum going? And is there an organizational structure for that?
Yeah, I'm gonna pass. Well, maybe I won't. There's a couple of things that's changed about our profession, and we don't, as a profession, we don't do as much coalition building. We don't do as much community organizing anymore. We don't do those things. Are not as valued in our schools as they used to be, as a profession. And so there's no one, it's hard to have someone that's speaking for these communities in ways that that these communities should be represented, or that we should ally with those communities in ways. And I just don't see that as much in our profession as it, and maybe I've been around a long time, as I think that it used to be. The politics of our profession, the policies of our profession, the types of things that we are not actively involved in many ways we shy away from. As a profession, because we're fearful of retribution from people who pass policies that benefits our profession. So, it's a little bit of, in many ways, I think our professional organizations are in tune of don't bite the hand that feeds you type of an approach, and that bothers me. I may be totally wrong with that, but that's sort of my feeling.
I'd like to pose a question that was raised in the Q&A that I think is going to continue this dialogue. The question is, when thinking about white supremacy, can you talk about the importance of radical allyship? What does it mean to address systems of harm as they impact colleagues as well as clients? Where does this work begin? And then with the personal is the political.
So I thought that question was really important. And in thinking about, the ways, I'll speak from a white ally perspective, and whether you want to call it co-conspirator or radical allyship or allies, right? We know that people who have lived experience should be the narrators of that experience, and that movements shouldn't be top down, but that there's a way that I think white people and white social workers can form the allyship that is needed to advance the cause of racial justice. So part of that is doing that deep listening work, doing the work of listening to clients and communities, to our fellow social workers who we may have harmed, our students, right? And so, I hate to fall on the cliche that the work begins with us, but I think in a lot of ways that remains, right? So the work of the majority of social workers are still white women in the US. That's a fact. It's changed and the demographics have changed, but I don't know the exact percentages, but if white folks and white women and white female identified folks aren't going to be doing that allyship work, that I think that will present problems going forward. What that looks like could be a lot of things. It could be about learning. It could be about reading. It could be about joining a group. It could be about doing white organizing work against for racial justice. So I think there's a lot of ways that work can form. But I like this question because I think we all have to take away that there's a part of the work that we can be involved in, regardless of our own, our racial identities. That there's a place for everyone to have in the movement.
Thank you, Laura. I've had the opportunity of being in predominantly white institutions and predominantly Black institutions. And one of the things I know is that allyship is a personal journey almost, that individuals have to decide how they want to move forward with it. And so it's critically important when we think of allyship, and I don't know that I can frame radical allyship, because I don't know, I exactly know what that means. But I will say, I don't know any movement that hasn't required the collaboration with other interested and committed groups, and who also have resources to support. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to take resources that are harmful, but it does mean particularly minoritized populations have to align themselves sometimes with groups who can help to support the direction that they want to go into. But I'd like to kind of segue more to think about allyship with the individuals who are served by the programs that we support. I've had the opportunity for the past 2 years to work with, in a leadership program, with individuals with lived experience in the foster care system, and to hear their voice and to elevate their voice in the allyship movement. And I think we have to do more than that. We have to listen to them when they're not our clients. What I mean is when they're in a position of leadership, and to advance them in their roles of leadership. That's where some really contextual listening can go on. And that I think we can, if we think of them as allies and not clients, then I think we have an opportunity to really make a difference in addressing racism and some of the harmful policies and practices that take place.
Thank you. I don't want to let James Herbert off the hook for fielding direct questions. So I've got one for you based on the final section you took up, particularly around social work education. So the question is, how can social work education adapt its curriculum and training to better equip future practitioners to combat structural racism and injustices, especially given the recent threats to democracy, the recent ideological repression, and concerns about academic freedom, particularly in the era where we just saw the end of affirmative action?
Wow. And as Laura said with her question, that truly can be a course in itself. But I do think there's a couple of areas where it's been challenging. I think schools of social work have found it very difficult, even though anti-racism and those sort of things is very embedded into in the value of our profession. I think where the rubber hits the road is when you get together in your schools and try to get faculty to all get on the same page to sing the same song related to this. And that's where the challenges become, which I find interesting in our profession, given that I think if you talk to social workers individually, they would say they're not racist. But then when you start to try to, as a group, to come together to develop an anti-racist curriculum, it's just it's a little bit like that old game Whammo, where you're hitting one thing, it bounces up over here, and you're hitting it there, and because I think people, I don't know why. I do think that there's concerns about sort of, is this something I don't know? Is this an area I feel uncomfortable in? So I think CSWE, and I only know this because I happen to currently sit on the board of accreditation, so I know sort of this. So what we've found with the new standards around sort of anti-racism being included, that many schools are pushing back on it. Either because they're in a state where there's a concern about how you contextualize this, how you teach it. I think some is a concern around sort of it's not the same concerns that they have with the LGBTQA in regards to we're a religious school and we can't talk. So you can't really just come out and say we don't want to do it, because then it comes across as being racist. And so then it comes down around academic freedom. If it comes around, there's other sort of what I call sort of things that sort of help you put into place that says this sounds good, but it won't work. That's usually what it sort of ends up being. It sounds good, but it won't work. And that's a concern, because I think that it's a little bit when you start to push us in these areas, it's when we show our true colors, that we're not really there to really embrace anti-racism in our curriculum and in our training and all those sorts of things. And I'm not sure how to get us there. And then I find in many ways, and so I'd love to hear what other people say, sometimes the people that are pushing these agendas also very concerned because we're such a hierarchical structure in academia. So if they're junior faculty or if they're, we're not supposed to use the word junior faculty, if they're young emerging scholars, sort of, they don't feel comfortable in pushing this agenda because they feel as though that tenure may not be accomplishable because of their agenda. So we have many mechanisms to not that has stalled this in a way. So I think what you end up getting is individuals within schools that take this mantle on and do it, but for a whole school to do it as a totality of who they are and as their identity. And there's some, but there's very few schools that have decided that this is something they want to take on. And I think some of that is lack of knowledge. Some of it is, a sense of uncomfortableness with the subject matter. There's lots of different things this year. So yeah. But I think it's doable, and I think that our authors who wrote in this section that I did had some wonderful suggestions around sort of critical race theory, critical trauma theory, some other ways that allows us to capture this information in a different way. So I'll leave it and pass on to my colleagues because they're all professors as well.
Something that I've thought of a lot lately that I think relates to this question and to the last one is the idea of thick solidarity, which I came across last year when I was doing some research on my book. I think a lot of us tend to focus on things and to put more energy into addressing issues where we're personally impacted in some way. And I think we have to resist that. So I looked up quickly while I was thinking so thick solidarity is an academic article, but it's defined as the radical belief in the inherent value of each other's lives, despite never being able to fully understand or fully share in the experience of those lives. I spent the last couple of years writing a book about the experiences of Black American families and how they're impacted by the child welfare system. And I will never understand what it's like to have an experience of slavery in my lineage and how family separations now impact Black families. I could have written a book as a Mexican-American gay man about how the child welfare system impacts Latinx families or LGBT families and say that I have some personal experience to bring to that, but I would never do that because that decenters the population that is most harmed by that system. And I think that's what we have to think more about. I will never understand what it's like to be a Palestinian whose population is literally undergoing a genocide right now, but I'm going to dedicate all of my advocacy and everything that I can to address an end to that oppression. That's what thick solidarity is about. And I think that's what we have to start teaching social workers to learn how to exercise that.
Yeah. Well, Alan, and I do think we try to teach our practitioners to sort of, but we use the term empathy. And I guess you're just saying is that word is sort of outdated and it's not something that we should use anymore. And I know Tony's
overused, maybe.
It may be overused in that regards. Just like we've tried to get people to think about the trauma, right? The trauma that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis living in various communities. And if you understand that, then you understand how sort of things are, but I agree with you. I keep hearing that scenario of the red ants and the black ants in the jar, right? And you know what I'm talking about, that they coexist as long as and then you shake the jar, then they start fighting each other. Right? So there is benefit in our world to have these various communities not being in fixed solidarity, as you call it, right? So there's people that benefit and the systems that benefit that these communities are not in agreement with each other.
I don't know how this fits in this conversation, but I think it's a part of the broader landscape. When I read the essays of our students every year who apply for Howard, they are looking for a profession and a place where they can find their identity and not be ignored in places and spaces. And so I think when I think of, Alan, what you said about thick solidarity, I think we also have to understand why people come, you know, to the profession of social work. And often they come with a specific population that they want to be helpful to. And I think we have to also acknowledge that. But it does every year. I'm always, every semester, every term, amazed that the students who are coming because they feel that they were not treated well in other institutional settings. And so the question becomes how we make our students, social work students, welcome in all institutional settings. And so that probably is a question for schools. HBCUs have a different experience, but I hear it, is that, and so it's safe and brave spaces for learning. You know, how do we make sure we have those brave spaces for learning before we can sort of get to the thick solidarity? People come for reasons. And so I just throw that out for conversation.
Right.
Thank you for those responses. So as we wrap up, we just have a few minutes left. I want to end with a question from an attendee that I would like each of you to spend a minute or two on. And I think this would be a great way to end the panel. The question is, could each of the co-editors speak to how they are carrying this important work forward beyond just publishing the book? I'd like to start with Dr. Abrams.
Oh, boy. Okay.
Alphabetical.
Thank you. I mean, I want to emphasize that my participation in this book stems from my interest in critical race studies. It stems from my solidarity work and racial justice work. So I see it as not a start, but a continuation of work that I deeply care about in social work, in my community and going forward. What I'd like to see, I think, going forward is like something I said earlier, where we're not always starting over, right? I know there's, you know, as I kind of launch into like the last segment of my career, or the last hopefully 10, 15 years, you know, what I would love to see at the end is that our institutions have started to change, that our educational programs really do reflect anti-racist principles, that, you know, as an administrator, you know, it would be great to see a time when our organizations aren't repeating the same conversations over and over. How do we infuse this content? How do we do this? How do we do that? Right. But I see it as a personal and a professional commitment to push back against the voices that want to suppress anti-racist thinking, and also to open up the conversations. You know, we don't, as you can see on this panel, we're all coming from different places. We don't all think exactly the same. We have racial differences, gender, sexuality, generation, right? So kind of co-creating an umbrella position where we can draw in folks and draw people in to feel part of the conversation, while still challenging some of the liberalism and neoliberalism and whiteness that often prevents us from moving forward. So not so concrete, but those are some thoughts.
Thank you. Dr. Sandra Edmonds Crewe.
Well, you know, I think I said earlier, and thank you so much, Lori, for that. This is my life's work. And so it is hard for me to say this piece will do that, because I've been in the vineyards for social justice for all of my 72 years, and I own that proudly. And so the question becomes for me, are there things that I can take away and make a difference? And the one thing that kind of jumps with me is the tenure process for African-American women. For that chapter particularly captured my attention, and because this is what the narrative looks like for many people. They're first told that your journey is going to be very difficult. And so that is your orientation session. Then they're told that, you have to be very careful how you speak within your faculty groups. Then they're told you have to be careful because you will become the mentors of other Black and minoritized students. And so all of these are warnings that will prevent you from earning tenure. And so I believe that I paid attention to that, and am I guilty of some of those things? And that I can really self-reflect and call myself out and call myself in as to, am I saying that to individuals who come to me for mentorship? Am I leading with the monsters and the monstrosity that shows up in the academic setting? So if I've had to narrow it to one thing, I would say that.
Thank you. Dr. Ellen Dettlaff.
Thanks, Justin. A lot of my work focuses in abolitionist and movement spaces, and I think in many ways that's how I carry this work forward, particularly the work that was described in my section of the book. But I've been thinking a lot more recently about my role in academic spaces. And something that really made a difference to me this past year, and I recommend it for other people who may be feeling the same way, was an article that I was fortunate to be able to publish in Abolitionist Perspectives in Social Work. And it talks about the idea of embracing the concept of fugitivity, recognizing those of us who are involved in this work, recognizing that academic institutions will never care about racial justice, have never cared about racial justice, and will never care about racial justice. Recognizing, and I think we've seen this recently just in the past few months, academic institutions care about where their money's coming from, and that's all they care about. So recognizing ourselves as fugitives within those systems, and when we embrace that role as a fugitive within those systems, then we no longer need any kind of acceptance or affirmation from those systems. Also, when we embrace ourselves as fugitive within those systems, that gives us permission to break the rules of those systems because we don't need permission or affirmation from those systems. And I understand that everybody has to make different risk calculations and how complicated the tenure process is, but to the extent that we're able, the role of an academic institution is to extract resources from it so that we could get our work done.
Thank you so much. Dr. James Herbert Williams. So
this, actually, since I've been in academia, my work has always been about the African-American community, and especially around African-American males, and and sort of how our life's trajectories are so impacted by the types of things that happens to us and many of them are systematic things that we have no control over in that regard. But in my professional adulthood, I've spent most of my life in very large, white, highly privileged institutions as a Black, and so I try to use those by being in those spaces and trying to point out the sort of the teachable moments that I might see. Now, of course, and I will say that because the four of us are all sort of senior people, right? So, and I hate to say it, but that privilege gives us a certain amount of privilege that I think some of our colleagues don't have, and allows us to do those sort of things. But given what just happened at Harvard, it doesn't matter compared to these days, whether or not you're a senior or not. If there's enough resources behind wanting to get rid of you, they'll get rid of you. So we do know that. But I do find that what I like to do is to point out to where there seems to be the voice of what you say and what you do in these institutions are very different. You know, the programs that you put in place that you say that's going to address these issues, that comes out with great fanfare, and then a year later, no one's talking about it. It's sort of drifted off to the side, right? So, and so what I find is that that's an important place sometime in academia to call people on their stuff, and that organizational stuff that they're not addressing, or they say they're addressing, but they're addressing it from a public image than they are from a realistic perspective. And that's a hard battle. That's why I quoted James Baldwin. It really is, sometimes it wears you out to be in these spaces. And so at some point you have to step back from it and sort of reconstitute who you are, because the space will wear you down. So I see this book as a wonderful starter of a conversation in our profession. And I'm hoping that each and every one of the authors that wrote in this book will write something on their own and continue this on in their particular area to keep this moving forward as regards to a conversation, because I think so I hopefully that this is sort of more, because there were some really young emerging scholars in this book, and I'm hoping that they will use this as a launching point for their agenda to bring this thing, to bring that more to light as well. So but I hope to continue to work in this area, and then when I'm no longer working as an academic and I'm sort of relaxing on some beaches in Brazil or someplace, that I will still be supporting the cause. I know that sounds cliche, but you got to do something.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for that. And I just want to end this discussion on thanking the co-editors for inviting me to write the epilogue, which I think for me is a great way to end this. I was tasked with considering what the book and what the symposium meant for our future, and I hope that the book, the symposium, and this webinar demonstrates how we can leverage social work history to address current issues, but also help us think through how we can address issues that we are yet to have to confront. And I hope that future social workers looking back on this 50 years from now they have receipts to hold our profession accountable, to see if we've lived up to the many promises and commitments that we've made. And I hope that they see a social work future that is that's far different from our past. So I want to thank all the panelists, the attendees. I'd especially like to thank Arizona State University School of Social Work for sponsoring this. And we look forward to continuing this fight together. Thanks for attending.